Every religion has its dark past due to the actions of those believers who take it upon themselves to interpret and invoke their perspectives on their faith. Throughout history, Christians, to include Protestants and Catholics as well as Muslims and Jews, have fought wars due to conflicts of ideology. From holy wars pitting one faith against the other, or witch hunts and inquisitions that sought to punish others out of superstition or a sense of perceived wrongs, these maladies also arrived in the New World and exacted a terrible toll. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Mormons, were no exception, with crimes both perceived and real embedded deep within their short history. What was the Mountain Meadows Massacre? Why did it occur? Who was responsible? Who were the victims? Was anyone held responsible?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was founded by Joseph Smith in Fayette Township, New York on April 6, 1830, and in 1831 he moved his church to Ohio, where he ran into trouble with the local authorities. Smith was accused of bank fraud, which may have been a ruse due to the locals not accepting his religious beliefs. Due to their unique interpretation of Holy Scripture and their practice of including baptizing the dead and polygamy, they were persecuted across several states, sometimes violently attacked. Although polygamy would not be outlawed in territories under federal law until 1862 by the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act, and again throughout the entire nation in 1882 under the Edmunds Act, most states and even cities and towns had their own laws and they were against the practice, which were often vigorously enforced against Mormons. Smith then moved on to Missouri, where the non-Mormons there also rejected his teachings, eventually leading to the Mormon War of 1838. Smith then again relocated his followers to Nauvoo, Illinois in 1839, but by 1842 tensions were again rising. In 1844, while Smith was under arrest for inciting a riot, a mob stormed the jail in Carthage, Illinois, and killed him. Smith's death sent a shockwave and induced a certain level of legitimate paranoia among the Mormons, who became militarized in order to defend themselves. His successor, Brigham Young, decided there was no place for the church within the confines of the United States and moved his people west in 1846 to the Utah Territory, which was then a part of Mexico. Young wanted to establish a religious community outside of the U.S. government and their jurisdiction, seeking refuge from further hostility where they could practice their faith in peace. By the time they reached what is today Salt Lake City, the territory had become part of the United States after the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, when Mexico had ceded the region, as well as California, New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona to the United States after the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. Upon arrival, the Mormons initially had an uneasy relationship with a few of the Indian tribes in the area, such as the Ute and Paiute, which sometimes resulted in violence. These encounters brought the army into the territory as tensions between the Mormons and Indians became impossible to ignore, and President James Buchanan empowered the U.S. government to intervene. Buchanan decided to send federal troops to Utah in 1857 to reassert control. The last thing Buchanan wanted was an Indian uprising against settlers and the government, and Young's instituting his own laws and policies were creating problems which were incompatible with U.S. federal law regarding settlements. The main problem was that Brigham Young, who was appointed governor of Utah Territory after it was formally recognized by the U.S. Congress in 1850, responded by declaring martial law, forbidding entry into the territory without official permission, arresting and incarcerating strangers, and still allowing polygamy. Young had also tried to have Congress recognize his territory as an independent state, which he called the state of Deseret. But this was rejected. In response, Young initiated the Mormon Reformation of 1856 to 1857, encouraging members of his sect to reject the ways of non-Mormons. He preached about their selective and unique relationship with God, reminding them of past persecutions and the dangers they faced, and he emphasized that they must only rely upon each other. Outsiders were the enemy, and that his followers should always be prepared to use violence to protect their community. Young told them that they were an independent community beyond the laws of the federal government and were in fact a law unto themselves. This led to widespread refusal to recognize United States officials in the region, eventually resulting in the Utah War. During this period, conflict, hysteria, and mistrust of non-Mormons surged, exacerbated by reports of prominent Mormon Parley P. Pratt's murder in Arkansas on May 13, 1857. Now, anyone entering Mormon territory was immediately suspected of being a spy and working for the federal government. The situation with Pratt was interesting. When Pratt married his 12th wife, Eleanor Macomb McLean Pratt, she was already married to a man named Hector Hugel McLean, and Pratt was captured by a small posse led by McLean. McLean stabbed Pratt 3 times in the chest, then returned and shot him in the neck. That event established Brigham Young's mindset. The Utah Mormons feared that these actions would continue to plague them and follow them, hence their migration west as others were also coming west. They grew suspicious of new immigrants who they believed might ally with incoming federal troops. This paranoia would prove deadly and start what would become known as the Utah War of 1857 to 1858 and the worst massacre in Mormon history. Brigham Young, his counselor Jedediah M. Grant, and other leaders preached with fiery rhetoric, warning against the evils of sin and those who dissented from or opposed the church. This only increased strains between the Mormons and the non-Mormons around them, including federally appointed officials. As a result, President Buchanan decided to replace Brigham Young as governor and, in what became known as the Utah War, sent an army to Utah to escort his replacement. But a situation would arise that would change everything. The Baker-Fancher wagon train, organized by Alexander Fancher and John Baker, comprised around 137 men, women, and children, and departed from Kansas in April 1857 bound for California. Upon reaching Utah in August, they knew nothing of Young's proclamation forbidding passage without a permit or the rising tensions. When they arrived, they were not welcomed, and they were denied supplies in Salt Lake City, having been instructed by Mormon leader George A. Smith to stockpile supplies against the threat of armed conflict with U.S. troops. This open hostility forced the Baker-Fancher wagon train away from the town, so they continued south to Mountain Meadows, where they stopped to rest and graze their horses and cattle. However, rumors soon began to spread among the Mormons that the immigrants had insulted their faith and violated Young's martial law edict by traveling without a permit, and that there were also federal spies in their ranks. There was no evidence presented, and there was no attempt to speak with the wagon train members to assess their intentions, but the Mormons' paranoia escalated. Mormon militia leaders Isaac C. Haight and William H. Dame, believing the immigrants to be a threat, planned their attack, but they needed permission from Young. Although a messenger was sent to Brigham Young asking for guidance, if not permission, local leaders proceeded with their plans before receiving his response. Haight sent word to one of his militia officers, John D. Lee, to come to Cedar City, and Lee arrived, meeting Haight, and, according to Lee's own 1877 confession, Haight told me all about the train of immigrants, that they were a rough and abusive set of men, that they had, while traveling through Utah, been very abusive to all the Mormons they met, that they had insulted, outraged, and ravished many of the Mormon women, that the abuses heaped upon the people by the immigrants during their trip from Provo to Cedar City had been constant and shameful, that they had poisoned the water so that all the people and stock that drank of the water became sick. Now, there was never any evidence presented to support any of this. Lee also said that he asked Haight on whose authority he was acting. According to Lee, Haight answered, "It is the will of all authority," giving Lee to understand that Brigham Young himself approved of the action. Lee then put the plan into motion. On September 7, 1857, a group of Mormon men, disguised as Paiute Indians along with some actual Paiute allies who they promised loot, ambushed the Baker-Fancher wagon train. The group circled the wagons, quickly dug defensive trenches, and fought back against their Mormon attackers. 7 of their group were killed on the first day, and another 16 were wounded. The Baker-Fancher group held out against the attack for 5 days before they began running out of ammunition, food, and water. As the siege wore on, the Nauvoo Legion's leaders discussed their situation, and they realized that it would be impossible to allow any of the Baker-Fancher party to survive, since they could testify that white men were among the attackers, and any report of such an attack would bring more U.S. troops to the region. On September 11th, militia leader John D. Lee arrived under a flag of truce and offered the immigrants safe passage if they surrendered their weapons and livestock to the Paiutes, who he said had been their attackers, with no exceptions. The Baker-Fancher party agreed, laid down their weapons, and abandoned the safety of their wagons. Trusting his word, the party laid down their arms and left their wagons and were marched into an open field. The Mormons separated all the adult men from the women and children, and as they marched away, the Mormon militia members opened fire, killing the men first. Then they attacked the women and older children, beating most of them to death in order to save on powder and shot. Many were slain with rifle stocks to the head, knives, or other blunt objects. 17 children under 6 years of age, now orphans, who were considered too young to possibly remember the event or identify the killers, were spared and taken in by Mormon families, and according to some reports, they seemed to have treated them quite poorly. When the killing was over, approximately 120 immigrants lay dead. The bodies were hastily buried in shallow graves, and the livestock and possessions of the Baker-Fancher party were taken by the attackers and later sold off to fellow Mormons. Following the massacre, the Mormon leaders attempted to conceal their involvement, blaming the Paiute tribe. All the participants in the massacre were sworn to secrecy, but as scholar Sally Denton notes, there had to be some explanation given for the deaths of the immigrants and the looting of their wagon train. She states, "After the fact, there was great uncertainty among Mormon leaders about how the crime would be viewed, both by the Gentile world and by the Mormons themselves, despite the earlier efforts to demonize the Fancher-Baker party. Now, the church hierarchy had to redouble its efforts to castigate the Paiute Indians, establishing a clear motive for why they could be said to have perpetrated the crime. To serve that end, the myth of the poisoned springs was invented. The Mormons had earlier spread rumors that the Baker-Fancher party had been hostile, for which there was absolutely no evidence, and the fabricated story by Haight, having told Lee about the poisoned water making Mormons sick, now became the new version of events. A poisoned stream that had caused the deaths of some Paiute Indians, who had then avenged these deaths in the attack. However, Chief Kanash of the Paiute Band of the Ute Nation, who had close ties to the Mormon community, rejected this story outright. Denton writes, "The story was ultimately discredited by military and other government investigators, and dismissed by various journalists and historians, but the Mormons tenaciously kept the fiction alive. For without the poisoned tale, the credibility of Indian hostility towards the immigrants completely dissolved, and with it a motive for the atrocity. Indian leaders themselves denied involvement just as vehemently, claiming any who participated were hired assassins and renegade mercenaries who had been promised payment in clothing, guns, and cattle by the Mormons." However, federal investigators, including Major James Henry Carleton, quickly discredited this narrative, uncovering the true perpetrators. Several Paiute were interviewed, and there were reports that even a couple of Mormons also volunteered information, feeling terrible about the event. Brigham Young was said to have responded to the message from Cedar City with instructions to leave the Baker-Fancher party alone, which, if it was sent, arrived too late, and he launched an investigation into the incident, placing Mormon leader George A. Smith, who had previously encouraged his fellow Mormons not to trade with the Baker-Fancher party, in charge. Despite the vast amount of evidence, including examining the bodies that were exhumed and testimonies from interrogations, most of those men responsible evaded justice. Smith himself concluded by June 1858 that the Mountain Meadows Massacre was the work of the Paiute Indians responding to the poisoning of their water by the immigrants, which was refuted. Regarding Young, his response to the messenger may in fact be true, but there is no record of Young giving his permission for the murders. However, modern historians suggest Young's rhetoric and policies contributed to a hostile climate that enabled the massacre, but he was never held accountable or responsible due to a lack of evidence. The Utah War delayed the formal federal investigation until May 1859, when Major James Henry Carleton arrived. Carleton concluded that the Mormons were responsible for the massacre. He and Jacob Forney, Superintendent of Indian Affairs for Utah, helped reunite the 17 children kept by the Mormons with their families back in Arkansas. Reports from the children themselves also varied, as well as reports on their condition, but the one constant was that they could all identify their mother's jewelry worn by Mormon women, notably the wives of John D. Lee and their father's branded horses in Mormon stables. William Bagley writes, "Reports on the condition of the rescued children contrast sharply. James Lynch charged the children were in a most wretched and deplorable condition, with little or no clothing, covered in filth and dirt. They presented a sight heart-rending and miserable in the extreme." James Carleton railed against the fiends who dared to even come forward and claim payment for having kept these little ones barely alive. But James Forney said, "I feel confident that the children were well cared for whilst in the hands of these people." Arrest warrants were then issued for Isaac C. Haight, John Higbee, and John D. Lee, but all the men fled the territory, with Lee going to Arizona, where he established Lee's Ferry. The outbreak of the Civil War prevented further measures against the perpetrators. However, in 1871, Philip Klingensmith, one of the participants in the massacre who had since left the church, provided the authorities with an eyewitness account of the event and agreed to testify in court with immunity. For many years, the LDS Church maintained that local leaders acted without approval from Brigham Young, slightly changing the story that the Paiutes did it. Even so, Haight, Higbee, and the others could not be found. Therefore, John D. Lee was the only one located, arrested, and brought to trial. He claimed that he was being made a scapegoat to protect Young and others. Nevertheless, he was found guilty and executed by firing squad in 1877 at the very site of the Mountain Meadows Massacre. None of the others involved were ever brought to justice. The Mountain Meadows Massacre remains one of the darkest chapters in Mormon and American history. Though long shrouded in controversy, continued research and official recognition have helped bring greater clarity to this tragedy. In 1990, relatives of the Arkansas immigrants joined with representatives of the Paiute Nation, Latter-day Saints residents in southern Utah, and church leaders in dedicating a memorial at Mountain Meadows. Rex E. Lee, president of Brigham Young University and a descendant of John D. Lee, held hands with victims' descendants and thanked them for your Christian-like willingness to forgive. In the early 2000s, the church made diligent efforts to learn everything possible about the massacre. Historians in the church history department scoured archives throughout the United States for historical records. Every church record on the massacre was also opened to scrutiny. In 2008, authors Ronald W. Walker, Richard E. Turley Jr., and Glenn M. Leonard concluded that while intemperate preaching about outsiders by Brigham Young, George A. Smith, and other leaders contributed to a climate of hostility, Young did not order the massacre. On September 11, 2007, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints finally abandoned their official story they had supported for 150 years and formally took responsibility for the Mountain Meadows Massacre, issuing an apology to the descendants of the young survivors of the Baker-Fancher party and to the Paiutes they had always blamed for the massacre. On this 150th anniversary of the massacre, President Henry B. Eyring taught, "The gospel of Jesus Christ that we espouse abhors the cold-blooded killing of men, women, and children. Indeed, it advocates peace and forgiveness. What was done here long ago by members of our church represents a terrible and inexcusable departure from Christian teaching and conduct." In 2011, the descendants of the survivors and members of the church joined together again at the designation of Mountain Meadows as a National Historic Landmark. The site includes several monuments in honor of those who had been killed, including the first one raised by Mayor Carleton in 1859 over the mass grave of 34 of the victims of the massacre who had been identified. In that year, 2011, Mountain Meadows was designated a National Historic Landmark, commemorating the lives that were lost.
Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.